He mocked his ex-wife for buying Barren years later. She walked in with his sons. "You call that woman your wife?" "Carson, the same one who couldn't even give you a child." The laughter echoed through the golden ballroom, sharper than glass. And for a moment, time stopped. He stood there, proud, powerful, unaware that in a few minutes, the truth would tear everything apart. Outside, rain brushed against the windows of his Charleston mansion, as if warning what pride could not hear. And I wonder, what would you have done in his place? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you what really happened that night. You could begin the part with 1 or 2 sentences that quietly introduce Carson and give the audience a sense of who he is before the shock hits. Here's the full part 1, rewritten to include that natural introduction. Keeping the same emotional flow and style, Carson Reed had everything people envied: money, charm, a mansion that glowed over the Charleston skyline. But what he loved most wasn't success. It was being seen winning. The music was soft, but his voice cut through it like glass. Carson stood at the center of the room, tall, proud, confident. The guests laughed. Cameras flashed, and he lifted his glass of champagne higher. "To my beautiful wife, and to the woman who failed to give me what every man deserves. My ex-wife, Emma." The laughter stopped. You could hear a pin drop. Even the band froze. Madison, his pregnant wife, looked at him in disbelief, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. But Carson only smiled wider, enjoying the silence he created. The power of being the man everyone watched. Inside, he told himself it was justice. He had built everything from nothing, and Emma had been the chapter of weakness he erased. Tonight, he was celebrating a future without her shadow. Then, the sound of heels echoed from the entrance. Slow, steady, unapologetic. The crowd turned. Emma walked in, dressed simply, her expression calm, her eyes unreadable. She didn't look like a woman broken by humiliation. She looked like someone who had already survived worse. Behind her, 2 little boys followed. They couldn't have been more than 3, dressed neatly, holding hands. The guests gasped. The boys had the same eyes as Carson, the same sharp chin, the same tiny dimple on the left cheek. For a second, Carson couldn't breathe. He blinked, as if his eyes were lying. Madison turned pale. The whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Emma stopped right in front of him, close enough for him to see the quiet fire in her gaze. "You wanted everyone to see what a real family looks like," she said softly, her voice steady. "Well, here they are, your sons." The words hung in the air, heavy, irreversible. The guests froze, torn between shock and fascination. Carson's mind screamed for control, but his body betrayed him. His throat tightened, his hand shook, and for the first time in years, he had no words. Madison let out a sound between a sob and a gasp, her glass slipping from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. The 2 boys flinched. One reached for Emma's hand. She didn't look away from Carson. He tried to speak, to laugh it off, to deny what his eyes already knew. But when one of the boys tilted his head and smiled, that same exact smile he saw in the mirror every morning, something inside him cracked. He remembered the nights he called Emma Barren, the interviews where he mocked her. The moment he walked away, every word he had thrown at her came back like shards of broken glass. Emma's heart was pounding, but her face stayed calm. She hadn't come for revenge. She came because truth deserved to be seen. For years, she had carried the weight of his cruelty alone. Tonight, she was giving it back to where it belonged. She didn't need to shout or cry. The silence in that room spoke louder than any revenge. Carson looked around, searching for someone to save him. His friends avoided his eyes. Madison's mother turned away in disgust. The cameras were still flashing, catching every second of his collapse. He suddenly realized this was not a party anymore. It was a reckoning. The man who once believed he could buy dignity was now stripped of it, right in front of everyone he had tried to impress. When Emma turned to leave, one of the twins looked back at Carson. His small voice broke through the hum of whispers. "Daddy." Just one word. Soft and pure. But it hit him harder than any accusation. Carson stood frozen, his eyes filling with something he didn't recognize anymore, shame. That night, the empire he built on arrogance began to crumble. The man who once mocked a woman for being barren came face to face with the truth he buried. And in the reflection of that truth, he saw not victory, but the hollow shape of a man who had lost everything that ever mattered. That night, when the word "daddy" slipped from the child's mouth, Carson's world didn't just fall apart, it rewound. Every sound, every stare in that ballroom dragged him back to the moment he began losing everything that mattered. 3 years earlier, he wasn't the man who stood frozen in shame. He was still powerful, untouchable, and cruel enough to believe love was something he could control. Back then, Carson Reed was the golden name of Charleston's investment world. He wore success like armor, sharp suits, sharp words, and a sharper ego. He had married Emma Parker, a woman whose kindness once softened the edges of his ambition. For years, she tried to give him what he wanted most, a family. After the 4th failed IVF, she sat in the hospital room holding his hand, whispering that maybe they could try adoption. He pulled his hand away. Adoption wasn't legacy, he said coldly. Legacy had to carry his blood, his name, his proof of success. Each failure hardened him. He began to treat Emma's body like a broken investment. At party, he smiled politely while making quiet jokes about bad genetics. Friends laughed because they thought it was harmless banter. But Emma felt the sting behind every word. She still cooked his favorite meals, still showed up at his office dinners, still smiled for the cameras when the newspapers called them Charleston's power couple. But at night, she cried quietly in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear. Jordan, Carson's oldest friend, tried to warn him. One night, over whiskey, Jordan said softly that he was turning Emma into a ghost in her own house. Carson laughed it off, saying he didn't marry her for emotion. He married her for image. Success, he said, deserved an heir. Jordan looked at him for a long time before replying that legacy without love was just vanity wearing a suit. But Carson didn't listen. He was already too proud, too afraid to face his own emptiness. The breaking point came on a grey December morning. The doctor said another IVF had failed. Emma reached for his hand again, whispering that maybe they should stop, that her body couldn't take more pain. Carson stood up, expressionless. "You're giving up again," he said, as if she had disappointed him in business. Not in heartbreak. That afternoon, he called his lawyer. By evening, he told her the marriage was over. The divorce papers arrived with a note from him. "It's not personal. I just need a future." The next day, the tabloids ran a headline quoting him. "Carson Reed says infertility is a tragedy of biology." Emma didn't respond. She packed her things quietly, left her wedding ring on the marble counter, and drove away before dawn. To the public, she disappeared. To Carson, she became nothing more than a closed chapter he never looked back on. He told himself he had done the right thing, that life was about efficiency, not emotion. But what he didn't know was that the final IVF procedure, done just days before the divorce, had worked. In a small clinic in Boston, a nurse smiled at Emma and whispered, "Congratulations." She was pregnant with twins. Emma sat there, numb at first, then trembling as tears filled her eyes. She pressed her hands over her stomach, whispering softly that they would never have to feel the cold she had lived through. She made one promise to herself that day: she would raise her sons in peace, far from the man who measured worth by perfection. Months later, she gave birth to Ethan and Noah, two healthy boys with their father's eyes and her gentle smile. As she held them close, she understood something Carson never did. Strength wasn't in building empires. It was in protecting innocence. And though the world believed she had failed as a woman, in that quiet hospital room, she finally felt whole. The idea came to him on a quiet Sunday morning. He was sitting by the window of his penthouse, staring at the skyline that used to make him feel invincible. Charleston glowed under winter sunlight. But to Carson, it looked smaller now. The tabloids had long stopped mentioning Emma. She had disappeared cleanly from his world, like a scar healed over. But some part of him hated that she had moved on so silently, without leaving him something to fix. He told himself he was at peace. But peace had always felt too much like weakness. So when his PR team proposed a legacy gala to celebrate his upcoming fatherhood, Carson said yes, without hesitation. A public celebration of life, legacy, and success. It sounded noble, even charitable. Yet beneath the surface, it was something darker. The truth was, he wanted Emma to see it. He wanted proof that he hadn't fallen apart after she left, that he was the man who won. He spent hours curating the guest list, approving every name personally. When he saw hers, he hesitated for a moment. Then he smiled. It wasn't cruelty that made him include her. It was something more twisted and quiet. He wanted her to witness the life she could have had if she hadn't given up. He told himself this was closure. But in reality, it was therapy through dominance. A man convincing himself that control was the same thing as healing. Jordan dropped by his office the next day. He found Carson signing the embossed invitations, gold letters shimmering under the light. Jordan picked one up, reading the title, Baby Gala, Celebrating Legacy and Love. He frowned. "You're really sending this to her?" Carson leaned back, smiling, that practice smile that always looked like a performance. "She deserves to see what I built," he said. Jordan studied him for a long time. "You mean what you rebuilt after destroying it?" The words hung in the air like a mirror Carson refused to look into. He poured himself another drink and changed the subject. But later that night, when the city lights flickered against the window, the sentence returned, rebuilt after destroying it. He wanted to believe he'd grown since the divorce. That success proved he'd been right. Yet deep down, A quiet voice whispered that all his victories were just noise trying to drown out failure. The invitation took 2 days to finalize. Heavy paper, gold-trimmed, sealed with the company crest. When he held the finished stack in his hands, they looked almost holy proof that his empire was intact, that he still mattered. He didn't sign the one addressed to Emma immediately. He left it on his desk for hours, staring at her name written in neat black ink. The room felt strangely heavy. For a moment, he almost tore it apart. But pride spoke louder than doubt. He sealed the envelope himself. His assistant offered to send it through the office courier, but Carson shook his head. He wanted to drop it in the post personally. It wasn't about efficiency anymore. It was about control, about deciding how the past should see him. As he slipped it into the mailbox, a cold wind brushed his face. He told himself this was the final act of closure, but the truth was simpler and sadder. He wasn't closing a chapter. He was reopening a wound he still needed to win against. That night, he slept well for the first time in months. Or maybe he just told himself he did. The invitation had been sent, and with it, something inside. Both of them began to move. For Carson, it was pride sharpening into cruelty. For Emma, it was silence turning into resolve. They were walking toward the same night, but for very different reasons. One to humiliate, the other to free herself. Carson spent the following weeks polishing every detail of the gala like a man preparing for war. He wanted perfection in everything: the lighting, the music, even the angle at which the photographers would stand. He wasn't hosting a celebration. He was staging a scene to remind everyone that he had won. Madison tried to tell him it didn't feel right. She said the event was too big, too flashy, that it looked like he was proving something. He dismissed her with a smirk. "People who win don't need to explain," he said coldly, though deep down he knew he was explaining himself to the ghost of Emma that still haunted his pride. In the quiet hours before sleep, Madison would rest her hand on her belly and ask if he loved their unborn child, or if the baby was just another part of his legacy. Carson would roll over, pretending not to hear. He told himself that feelings complicated life, and he didn't build an empire by being emotional. What he didn't see was how his indifference began to spread like frost through his home. Every cruel choice he made toward the woman he once loved slowly poisoned the woman who lay beside him now. At the same time, in a small Boston apartment, Emma folded the invitation and placed it in a drawer. She had reread it enough to memorize every word. There was no anger left, only a calm certainty that truth no longer needed to hide. That night, after tucking Ethan and Noah into bed, she sat by their side, brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. He stirred slightly, murmuring something about a dream. She smiled, whispering that everything would be fine, but her eyes carried the weight of years. Emma wasn't going to the gala to fight. She was going to end a wound that had followed her like a shadow. As she watched her boys breathe softly in their sleep, she thought about the woman. She used to be the one who begged for love and called pain endurance. That woman no longer existed. The woman sitting there now was someone who had built her strength quietly. Through nights of worry and mornings filled with small laughter, she knew showing up would change everything. People would talk, Carson would rage, and the past would bleed into the present. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered were the two small lives that carried his eyes and her heart. They deserved to know the truth, even if it broke the man who once broke her. Back in Charleston, Carson stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, practicing his smile. the same one that made investors trust him. He told himself that power wasn't about kindness, it was about control. And yet, for a fleeting second, he saw his reflection blur behind his own eyes, was a flicker of doubt he quickly buried under arrogance. That night, as the city lights of Charleston glowed like scattered gold, two people prepared for the same evening in two different worlds. One believed he was untouchable. The other had already learned what it meant to survive. When dawn came, they would both walk into the same room, he to reclaim his pride, and she to reclaim her peace. The night of the gala arrived, with more glitter than warmth. The grand magnolia shimmered like a cathedral made of glass. Reporters lined the red carpet. Flashes bouncing off champagne flutes and designer gowns. Inside, every chandelier burned bright. Every violin note carefully timed to perfection. Carson had made sure of that. To him, beauty was control, and control was safety. He moved through the room like a man on stage. Every handshake, every compliment was a performance. Madison, glowing in her silver gown, stayed close but quiet. Her smile looked perfect, but her eyes didn't. Jordan noticed. He had watched Carson lose himself before, and tonight he saw it again, the same hunger disguised as confidence. Carson took the microphone when the band faded. The room hushed, lights narrowing to a soft golden hue. His voice carried easily, smooth and calculated. Tonight, we celebrate legacy, love, and the future that carries our name. Applause followed like obedient thunder. He raised his glass, soaking in the attention that always felt like oxygen. In that moment, he truly believed he had won. Then the doors at the end of the ballroom opened. A rush of cold air swept in, catching the light. Heads turned instinctively. At first, the guards moved, ready to stop whoever was coming. But then they froze. Two small children walked in, hand in hand, eyes wide with curiosity. A woman followed behind them, calm, poised, steady. Something in the way she carried herself made everyone step aside without a word. Mothers protect children. No one interrupts that. From near the back, Jordan straightened. He had known she would come. Days earlier, he had found her number, written on an old card in Carson's drawer. He didn't tell anyone, not even Carson. But he had sent a message. If you still need your truth, the doors will be open at 9. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was faith. Either way, he had left a side entrance unlocked. Now, watching her walk into the ballroom, Jordan's chest tightened. The storm he'd tried to stop was already here. Carson saw her and froze. For a second, he thought she was a ghost, a memory given shape. Emma's black dress was simple, almost defiant in its lack of glitter. She didn't look like someone chasing attention. She looked like someone bringing truth. The crowd parted around her like water. No one spoke. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, unsure if they were witnessing scandal or salvation. Madison's hand trembled on her glass. She turned toward Carson, confusion and fear fighting behind her eyes. Carson's voice caught mid-breath. Emma. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to echo. Emma stopped a few steps from the stage. Her gaze was calm, almost kind. You wanted everyone to see what a real family looks like, didn't you? Carson. The words fell softly, but they hit like glass. Whispers broke through the silence. Guests turned. Phones lifted. Emma took another breath. then gestured gently toward the doors. The twins stepped forward, Ethan and Noah, dressed neatly in matching shirts, clutching small stuffed animals. Their faces were innocent, but unmistakable. The same blue eyes, the same crooked smile. The crowd gasped, as if the air had been taken from the room. Madison went pale. Jordan closed his eyes. Carson stepped down from the stage, the microphone still in his hand. The sound of his shoes on marble was deafening. He wanted to speak, to control the narrative, but his voice betrayed him. His breath was uneven, his hands trembling. Emma's eyes never left his. "This man," she said quietly, "once called me broken. He told the world I couldn't give him children." Her gaze softened, but as you can see, the only thing broken was his heart. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. The cameras started flashing again. Madison let out a strangled sob, setting her glass down before it could slip. She whispered something no one heard and turned away. One of the twins flinched at the noise, clutching Emma's dress. Emma bent down, whispering reassurance, her hand steady on his shoulder. Carson looked at the children, as if seeing reflections of everything he had destroyed. He tried to speak. "It's not what you think," he started, but even he didn't believe it. The microphone caught the crack in his voice, amplifying his fear. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, curiosity shifting into discomfort. No one dared approach him. Jordan finally moved forward, his voice low, meant only for Carson. "You wanted proof that you'd won," he said. "Well, there it is. You lost the only thing that ever mattered." Carson's eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with disbelief, as if his own story had turned against him. Emma stood tall, her voice gentle now. "I didn't come to ruin you, Carson. You did that yourself. I came because they deserve truth. That's all." Then she turned, taking her son's hands. The silence that followed was almost holy. No one applauded. No one moved. The chandeliers shimmered above, like they were trembling too. Carson stood there, surrounded by people, yet completely alone. As Emma and the twins reached the door, one of the boys turned back. His small voice broke the stillness. "Daddy." Just one word. Simple. Pure. It landed heavier than any accusation. Carson's throat closed. For years, he had chased legacy, power, image, and now, standing in front of the only legacy that ever mattered, he could barely breathe. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. The sound echoed through the hall like a verdict. That night, the Grand Magnolia didn't just host a gala. It witnessed the fall of a man who mistook pride for love. The chandeliers still glowed, but their light felt cold, reflecting the ruin of a man who finally saw himself clearly. And too late. The silence after Emma's departure was heavier than any noise. For a moment, no one dared to move. Then whispers broke out like sparks in dry grass, spreading through the room until the air was thick with gossip and disbelief. Carson stood still, his body frozen in place, while cameras turned toward him like a firing squad. Every flash of light felt like another bullet of humiliation. Madison was the first to move. She ripped off the diamond bracelet he had given her and threw it on the table. Her voice trembled between anger and heartbreak as she shouted that he had used her to prove something sick. "You humiliated her to make yourself feel powerful," she cried. "And now you made a fool of me." The crowd stared as she walked out, tears streaming down her face, the silver fabric of her gown brushing past the spilled champagne. Carson tried to reach for her, but she didn't look back. Reporters whispered to each other. Phones raised, capturing his downfall in real time. Carson turned to the guests, desperate to reclaim control. "It's not what it looks like," he said, his voice breaking. "She hid them from me. She deceived me." But even as the words left his mouth, he heard how weak they sounded. Emma, standing near the exit, stopped and turned her head slightly. Her voice was steady and cold. "I hid them from the man who called me broken," she said, "not from their father." The room went silent again. His mother, Margaret, stepped forward, her face pale and eyes filled with shame. "You have 2 sons," she said softly, "and you chose to mock their mother in public. What have you become?" Carson tried to speak, but nothing came out. The woman who had once been his greatest supporter turned her back on him, shaking her head as if mourning someone already dead. A few guests left quietly. Others stayed only to witness the end of a king. The band stopped playing, unsure whether to wait or flee. Somewhere near the back of the hall, one of the twins began to cry, the sound thin and frightened. It sliced through the tension like a blade. The other child joined in, calling softly for their mother. The guests looked away, ashamed to watch what they had come to celebrate turn into ruin. Carson's knees felt weak. He wanted to shout, to blame someone, to control the narrative like he always did. But all he saw in the reflection of the champagne glass was a man he didn't recognize. His voice cracked into the empty air. "I was trying to make it right," but the words sounded hollow. Too late to matter. Jordan approached him, his voice low, filled with pity instead of judgment. "You wanted to humiliate her," he said, "and all you did was destroy yourself." Carson didn't answer. His hands trembled, his heart pounding in his chest. Around him, the once beautiful ballroom looked like the aftermath of a storm. Tables overturned, wine spilled, guests gone. The chandeliers still burned above, but their light no longer felt warm. It only revealed the emptiness beneath. When everyone had left, Carson remained, alone among the ruins of his celebration. The smell of alcohol mixed with perfume and wilted flowers. A camera light flickered in the corner, still recording, catching his hollow stare. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint sound of the twins crying again before the door finally closed. The echo lingered, fragile and haunting, like the sound of a soul breaking. For the first time in his life, Carson Reed understood what it meant to be truly powerless, not because others had taken something from him, but because he had given it away himself. Pride, love, dignity, all traded for the illusion of control. And now, as the lights dimmed and silence returned, he stood surrounded by broken glass and fading gold. The last man left to witness his own collapse. By the next morning, the empire that had taken Carson years to build began to crack from every direction. The newspapers printed his humiliation on the front page. His face, once a symbol of power, now carried headlines like "The CEO who mocked motherhood." His company's stock dipped, and by noon, the board demanded an emergency meeting. Carson sat in his office, staring at the news, scrolling across the screen, each word stripping another layer of his pride. Madison filed for divorce before the day ended. Her lawyer sent a short letter, cold and professional, saying she wanted no alimony, only distance. The ring he once slipped on her finger lay inside an envelope that came with the papers. He didn't open it. The silence in the penthouse was too loud. Even the ticking of the clock felt like it was counting the seconds of his fall. Calls came in from business partners. Not out of concern, but damage control. They wanted statements, apologies, explanations. But no one wanted the truth. The board suspended him indefinitely to preserve the company's reputation. A spokesperson said they appreciated his years of service. It sounded like an obituary for a man still breathing. That night, he poured himself a drink, but couldn't swallow. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger, a man aged 10 years in a single day. The city lights stretched beneath him, but all he saw was emptiness. He used to think this view was proof of victory. Now it looked like punishment. Jordan came by, unannounced. He looked tired, like someone who had watched too many people destroy themselves. Carson didn't speak at first, and Jordan didn't offer sympathy. "You built your life around winning," he said quietly, "but you forgot what worth meant." Carson stared at him, eyes hollow. "I thought I could control it," he murmured. Jordan shook his head. "Control is the illusion of cowards. Real men take responsibility." Then he left, closing the door with a silence that stung more than anger. Hours passed. Carson sat in the dark, phone glowing beside him. Messages kept coming in, some mocking, some pitying. "Non sincere." Then a new one appeared. From Emma. The text was simple. "DNA test tomorrow. Be a man." For once, he stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling. For the first time in years, he felt fear not of losing money or reputation, but of facing something real. His chest tightened, not from arrogance this time, but from the unfamiliar weight of regret. The man who once thought the world revolved around him now couldn't even find the strength to move. He set the phone down, staring at the faint reflection of his own eyes in the glass. The city glowed behind him, but there was no warmth in it, only distance. For the first time, he saw what success looked like without love, an empty tower filled with noise and ghosts. And as the night deepened, he realized that pride had never protected him. It had only made the fall harder. The DNA test changed everything. But not the way Carson expected. It didn't give him peace. It gave him responsibility. For months, his life became a quiet reconstruction, not of his career, but of his character. The scandal had erased his wealth, his status, and most of his friends. What remained was a man learning to exist without applause. He moved out of his penthouse and into a small 2-bedroom apartment near the river. The place was simple, almost bare. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. He started working as a financial consultant for small businesses, earning less than he ever had. But he found something strangely honest in starting over. Each morning, he made coffee with his own hands, washed his own dishes, and realized how much of life he had missed while chasing an illusion of control. It took months before Emma agreed to let him see the boys again. The first visit was awkward. The twins were shy, hiding behind her legs, whispering to each other as if deciding whether he was safe. Carson knelt, smiled, and handed them small toy cars. He didn't say much. He just sat on the floor and watched them play, waiting for them to come closer on their own. By the time they left, one of them had quietly slipped the red car into his pocket, a small, wordless sign of trust. He joined a local support group for single fathers. At first, he only listened. The stories of other men, some broken, some healing, reminded him that failure wasn't the end if it taught you how to love better. He learned patience. He learned how to sit in silence without trying to fix it. When one of the counselors said that being a father was about presence, not perfection, Carson finally understood what Emma had meant all along. His visits became more frequent. He started helping with small things, tying shoelaces, building Lego towers, sitting through endless questions about dinosaurs and outer space. He found himself laughing more often, the sound soft and uncertain at first. Sometimes the boys called him Carson. Other times, without thinking, they called him Dad. Every time they did, something in him healed a little more. Emma watched from a distance. She told herself she only agreed for the children's sake. But each time she saw him kneel to listen, wipe their hands, or wait patiently while they struggled to zip their jackets, her certainty began to fade. He wasn't the man who once humiliated her. He was quieter now, humbler, carrying the weight of his mistakes but using it to steady himself instead of destroy others. One evening, as he dropped the boys off, she saw him pause before leaving. He looked at her, not with pride or pleading, but with simple gratitude. "Thank you for letting me try," he said softly. She nodded, unsure what to feel. After he left, she stood by the window, watching him walk away in the snow. There was no bitterness in her anymore, only the faint warmth of closure. For Carson, redemption didn't arrive in grand gestures. It came in quiet mornings when his sons ran into his arms, in the sound of laughter that once seemed impossible, in the peace that came from finally being small and human. He had lost everything that once defined him, but in its place, he found something far greater: the courage to love without needing to win. 2 years passed quietly, and life had softened around the edges. The scars were still there, but they no longer hurt to touch. Carson had learned to live without noise, without headlines, without the constant need to prove something. The twins were turning 5, and that small fact felt bigger than any milestone he had ever achieved. The birthday party took place in a small park in Boston. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of grass and laughter. A simple picnic table stood under a tree, covered with a homemade cake and 2 candles shaped like the number 5. Ethan and Noah ran in circles, their laughter echoing through the open field. Carson watched them, sitting beside Emma, who smiled softly while keeping her distance, not out of resentment, but out of peace. Jordan arrived first, carrying a box of balloons and pretending to struggle with the weight just to make the kids laugh. Carson smiled and helped him tie them down. Their friendship had healed too. Not perfectly, but honestly, there was no more judgment in Jordan's eyes. Only quiet respect for a man who had finally chosen to grow instead of hide. Later, Madison came with her little girl, Lily. For a moment, everything went still, the past hanging between them like unspoken air. Then Emma stood up, walked over, and offered a warm smile. "Lily can join the boys if she likes," she said gently. Madison nodded, her eyes misty. The children began to play together instantly, chasing bubbles across the grass. Their laughter, louder than any old memory of pain. Carson watched them all, Emma speaking softly to Madison, Jordan lighting candles, the kids running barefoot in the sunlight. Something shifted inside him. It wasn't forgiveness that moved him most, but the sight of people choosing kindness after so much hurt. He remembered the man he had been and barely recognized him. The arrogance, the hunger for control, all of it felt so small compared to this simple peace. When the candles were lit, Everyone gathered around the cake. The twins shouted together, "Make a wish." "Daddy." Carson smiled, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't wish for success, power, or redemption. He only wished for the strength to keep showing up for them. For himself. For the kind of love he once thought he didn't need. After the cake, they all sat on the grass watching the sunset paint the sky in gold. Emma laughed at something Jordan said, and even Madison joined in, her hand resting gently on Lily's shoulder. No one talked about the past. It no longer needed words. The air carried something new, a quiet understanding that life could start over. Even after everything fell apart, Carson leaned back, the sound of his son's laughter blending with the breeze. He realized that family wasn't about perfection or bloodline or success. It was about showing up when it mattered, forgiving when it was hard, and loving even when you were afraid. He looked around at the people sitting beside him, broken once, but not beyond repair, and felt something he hadn't in years home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the boys ran toward him, shouting for one last photo. He pulled them close, their small hands gripping his shirt, their faces bright with joy. Behind the camera, Emma smiled. The shutter clicked, freezing the moment forever, not of a perfect family, but of a real one. From the night he mocked love to the day he learned to kneel before it. Carson's journey was not about revenge or loss. It was about redemption. He discovered that family isn't built from perfection, but from forgiveness, courage, and the quiet act of showing up. His fall became his awakening, and through it, he finally learned what it means to love without pride. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and let someone else feel its echo. Subscribe, like, and share emotional echoes to keep these stories alive. Thanks for listening.